Greetings, young historians. I've chosen to record this World War II on the Horizon lecture so that we have a little bit more time in class for fun activities and things. Hopefully it's not too echoey for you. I feel like I'm standing in the Great Hall at Hogwarts almost talking to you. We're going to get through this pretty quickly. It should be probably about 10 minutes total. I'm not going to try to linger or get too long-winded. So as previously discussed, what had caused the economy to rebound in the end was not the New Deal rebound from the Great Depression. It's not really going to be the New Deal, but it's going to be the economic expansion that occurred as America geared up for World War II. But the New Deal did much for Americans. It did certainly put many back to work. It certainly did decrease our unemployment rate dramatically. And it also did a lot for Americans psychologically. We began to believe that we could pull out of the Depression, even as the New Deal, it solidified opposition against the growing power of the federal government. Obviously, not everybody's on board with the New Deal, and we saw some dissenting voices in the last chapter and from last week, and a couple of them were on your quiz. Hopefully you got those right. Initially, few understood the signs of the great conflagration that was going to come that would be World War II. The seeds of World War II were sown in the Treaty of Versailles as Germany, burdened both by having to take sole responsibility for World War I, I'm looking at you, the War Guilt Clause, and by the massive amount of reparations it was forced to pay in return. They struggle with rising inflation and growing anger against the rest of the world. That will open the door to people like Adolf Hitler to rise to power. Much of the nation's anger was directed against Jews and other outsiders, other social outcasts, and the views were made manifest as the National Socialist Party, or the Nazi Party, captured an increasing share of the German imagination and of the German people's votes. Once in power, the Nazis quickly moved to end free speech and limit freedom of assembly. Under the leadership in particular of Adolf Hitler, Germany renounced the Treaty of Versailles, and they began to rebuild their army. Remember that the Treaty of Versailles had put a cap on the size of the German army, navy, where they could put it, what they could develop with it. And Hitler basically reneges on all of those provisions, goes back on all of those deals. In 1938, Hitler began his series of conquests that would eventually bring the United States into World War II. In Italy, the rise of the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini presaged what would come in Germany just a few years later, and it's really not long before the two dictators are working together to reshape the world. Mussolini came to power in Italy on the back of the same sort of demands and dissatisfactions that the Italian people had, as Hitler maybe did with the German people as well. Italy was sort of promised some territory after World War I, or during World War I. They didn't, of course, get that territory, so there's this lingering anger and resentment, and the Italian economy also is not doing very well. So the same sort of circumstances will lead to the rise of many different dictators. Stalin also, that's maybe a whole different conversation. But at this point, just understand that many of these dictators who share similar values and who are fascist, totalitarian in some respects, they're going to come to power for some of the same reasons. In Japan, also, militarists are creating a new state based on expansionist principles and this belief in Japanese superiority. Its goal was Asia for Asians, quote, dating from earlier decades, and this really underscored its desire for Japanese domination of the Pacific Rim. Japan wanted to replace Britain, France, and the US as dominant powers in the Asian sphere. Beginning in the early 1930s, Japan began a series of moves that expanded its control into China. Eventually, they installed a puppet government based in Manchuria, and they killed and raped as many as 300,000 Chinese in the city of Nanking in what would become known as the Rape of Nanking. Throughout all this, the rest of the world did little or nothing. U.S. Secretary of War Harry Stimson proclaimed the Stimson Doctrine, asserting that the United States would never recognize the new government, but there was little else that the rest of the world did as this horrific thing was occurring. Even as word of the Rape of Nanking spread in 1937, European countries kind of sat on their hands. They had memories of the First World War still fresh in their minds, and not many people were anxious to go back to war. As late as 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain sought to accommodate Hitler through a policy known as appeasement. Appeasement would, so Chamberlain and others thought, preserve an increasingly fragile peace. The United States, buffered by these two massive oceans, here we've been blessed by Providence with these two great oceans to insulate us from the rest of the world's wars. We regret these incidents. We regret the things that will eventually lead to appeasement, but we see things like that, and certainly the rape of Nanking too, as beyond our control. Like many in Europe, Americans increasingly viewed World War I as having been an avoidable conflict that had cost nations greatly in terms of blood, in terms of treasure. In the mid-1930s, the Nye Committee, chaired by North Dakota Senator Gerald Nye, had concluded that a powerful group of businessmen and bankers had pushed the U.S. into World War I to make sure that the Allies could repay their loans. Many were convinced that America would have no place in another war if that's the reason why we went to war in the first place sometimes. The Nye Committee was probably not correct in all of its assertions. The Nye Committee isn't something that historians look back on and say, wow, that's some bang up history work right there. But it certainly did shape and direct American thinking at the time. So that's why it's significant. It's not really significant because it's correct, but it's significant because it pushes Americans to think twice about getting involved in another war. Are we really going to war for the right reasons, in a sense? American isolationist sentiment was also manifested in Congress, and we're here at the Neutrality Acts. A series of Neutrality Acts prohibited aiding or abetting either side in the growing European conflict. Americans who traveled on belligerent ships or ships that belonged to nations at war were told that they did so at their own risk, and an arms embargo attempted to further distance America from the conflict. By the late 1930s, though, it's increasingly clear, at least to FDR, that events in Europe and elsewhere could not be ignored that much longer. Already, some young Americans had joined the aptly named Abraham Lincoln Brigade to fight the fascists in the ongoing civil war in Spain. Spain was a place where German fascists and equipment were never far from the battlefield. Franco had the support of Hitler and other dictators. The sinking of the USS Panay in 1937 by the Japanese also spurred American anger, but most Americans were not yet ready for war. Meanwhile, American scrap metal and American oil continued to be sent to Japan, further fueling that nation's war machine. Because China and Japan, you might be thinking, what about the Neutrality Acts? China and Japan were not formally at war, and so the Neutrality Acts didn't apply. Eventually, we will cut off American shipments to Japan, and that'll be one of many factors that push the Japanese to carry out the attacks on Pearl Harbor. As word of attacks against Jews and others in Germany spread, and Jews there attempted to emigrate, most American Jews urged action. They were upset by America's immigration policies that turned refugees away. There are many different types of immigrants who we can welcome into our country. Most countries have some sort of provision to allow in refugees, and our allowances at the time were much lower than American Jews and others in America watching overseas would want them to be. FDR did manage to admit some Jews in 1936 and 37 by combining the German and Austrian quotas. They kind of move some numbers around. They try to kind of massage the numbers to make it work, but a congressional proposal that would have expanded the quotas further was voted down. Opponents of such legislation were helped by the speeches of people like aviation hero and, the Kim K of the 20s, I think as we call him, Charles Lindbergh. Lindbergh frequently appeared at rallies of the America First Committee. The America First Committee was an organization formed to keep the U.S. out of the war, and he and others advocated not increasing our immigration quotas, not increasing our refugee allowances. By 1939, though, events in Europe had swayed many Americans, most of whom now supported Britain and France in their struggle against Germany. You might recall from World War I that Americans, or hyphenated Americans, maybe recent immigrants, are somewhat divided in allegiance, or the war makes them carry out their Americanism, or maybe prove themselves to be American in different ways, and there's tremendous anti-German sentiment that manifests in different forms. World War II is going to see somewhat of a continuation of that, but it's not going to be nearly as strong. Most Americans are going to support Britain, France, and the Allies, even if they do have German blood. We're not going to see this division in allegiances in World War II nearly like we did in World War I. So kind of keep that in mind as we're entering it. 1939, of course, is going to see Hitler and Germany invade Belgium. They're going to get into France eventually, and we're going to see by 1940 World War II really has gotten going. We're going to pick up there next week. If you would like to get another head start beyond just listening to this, we're under 10 minutes, check out the crash courses. I would definitely recommend those. I think those are incredibly helpful. And as always, if you have any questions or concerns, email me, reach out to me, and I'm so excited to see you guys next week. Have a good rest of your weekend.